All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And yeah, today I've got a special treat for you. So, guess what? I've completed all of the panel reviews. I've got a couple things possibly in the works, but it looks like that's not going to happen. So, it looks like I'm finished my panel review shows with the experts, specifically on topics related to the historicity of the Shroud of Turin. Obviously, okay, well, what's next? Now we're going to be in panel reviews. I'm going to be looking at the scientific evidence related to the formation of the images. But before I get to that, obviously, I need to do my solo show, panel review summary shows, right? Where I go over the panel reviews, listen to the experts, do a little bit of more investigation, and give you an update. Where have I come out since the original 2018 solo shows that I did? Obviously, that's what we're reviewing in my panel review shows. And we've completed all of parts 1 through 3, where I talk about the historicity of the Shroud. Okay, great. So we've reviewed those original solo shows from like 5 years ago. I've gotten the opinion of the experts, some more information, more details to do a more thorough investigation. Well, now it's time for my panel, my summary shows. Where do I stand now? What has changed? And as you know, I did part 1 in about 4 parts, where I went over my panel review shows parts 1 through 3, on various evidences, the carbon dating, the Darcy memorandum, the tech shroud as a textile, the Sudarium of Oviedo, Hungarian Prey Codex, all of that fun stuff there. In my summary shows part 2, I'm going to be picking up from my panel review shows part 4 through 7, and then giving my summary shows. And it'll probably be, again, I'll have to do it in 4 parts. In this part, I'm just going to have time to do a very quick one of the topics from part 4. But just before I get into that, just a couple things. So the one thing is I wanted to make kind of a PSA announcement on a personal level. I've kind of decided that it's going to be best for all parties involved just to leave that out and not get into that. I think that's the best thing to do there. However, I do have something that I want to say that's not related to my show today, based on a video. So let me just share my screen here. So if you guys remember, the Shroud Skeptics here from Reason to Doubt, Jordan and Jared. And believe it or not, I think that these guys in general do a great job. They've done about 6 shows on the Shroud. I would recommend, even though I disagree with them and think they're totally out to lunch and wrong, I would highly recommend at least 4 of their shows. Unfortunately, this latest show that they did with Hugh, I mean, I would recommend it if you want to see the Shroud Skeptic perspective on the issues that they talk about. But in my opinion, it is quite biased, one-sided, and they're not engaging in critical thinking. It's more just kind of, hey, give us the Shroud skeptical side. And okay, fair enough for what it is. Yeah, it does a fine job. It reveals some good data, some good conclusions, some not so good stuff, and I think some misrepresentations on the pro Shroud side. That's fine. I'm sure I've got some videos that are a little too one-sided against the Shroud skeptics on some of my shows and stuff. So that's fine. It is what it is. But I wanted to respond. Obviously, you can see these guys are kind of where it's at in terms of Shroud skeptics. Even big name atheist Ben Watkins, a lot of respect for that guy. But he's been totally suckered into this stuff, so he thinks the Shroud's not authentic. Of course, look, Hugh Ferry, Dale Allison, that's it for him. Ben, be a better critical thinker on the Shroud, please. Like, look at the credible pro Shroud side first. Don't just, oh well, they sound convincing. Cool. It sounds like Hugh knows what he's talking about. I can just believe whatever he says. Do better. Be skeptical of your skepticism. And this is the point that I wanted to make against these guys that I left in the comments. But yeah, again, no disrespect to outside of the Shroud, Ben Watkins is definitely a critical thinker. Like I said, a lot of respect for him, and a lot of respect for Jordan and Jared, because when they want to be, they can be good critical thinkers. I just don't think that they were so in this episode. But there was something that I kind of gave as an illustration that was about the shroud image superficiality. So let me play this little clip where Hugh Ferry is giving this, what I think, a very hasty, very biased assessment of saying, well, see, the pro shroudies are nuts for thinking the superficiality can't be reproduced by a painting or a medieval artist or something like that. And I kind of took these guys to task. I'm saying, you guys are supposed to be skeptics, be skeptical of your skepticism, because they just buy it. Seems to me that they just buy it hook, line, and sinker. So with that said, let's see them in context and see what they said first.
And they went, no, you're not using, we've got a book called the Frenway Invisible Mending System. I said, yes, that's the system that he's using. And they went, but maybe there's another invisible mender who can do it better. So I said, yes, there is. The British, the Invisible Mending Company of London.
Okay, so he's just finishing off his take on the invisible reweave. That's not what I'm looking at. Wait till he gets to superficiality in a moment.
I sent them a piece of hanky as well with a hole in it and said, right, fix it. And they did. And that wasn't invisible either. And I'm the only person to have done this. And you just think, why hasn't people tested it out? Look at this. You're going to love this. Can you see what it is? Oops, perhaps I'll hold it this way up, make it easy. It's not just a piece of cloth. It's a piece of 3-to-1 hand-woven herringbone twill. It's the only piece of 3-to-1 hand-woven herringbone twill to the exact proportions and dimensions of the shroud ever made. And who made it? Me, because I wanted to know whether it was possible and what it looked like, and whether things would soak into it in the way that people claim. Oh yes, look at this. If you put ink on a cloth, you'll soak into it, and it's you can't get cloth on the surface of fibers. Now, before your very eyes, ladies and gentlemen, here is some ink, and here is some cloth, and I'm going to scribble on it, and then I'm going to turn it upside down and show you. Oh my goodness, it's only there on the uppermost fibers of the cloth. But that's impossible. It can only be done by a miracle or a genius, the most cunning medieval forger of all time.
All right, so that's the clip there, right? And yeah, as you can see, oh my goodness, there was no color from that marker on the back of the shroud. Pro shroud guy, that Jordan Jared having a grand old time. They seem to, that proves it. Yep, pro shroudies are idiots. They never thought to scribble on the back of a napkin. So okay, so aside from my scolding, anyways, I went in the comments and I kind of scolded them a little bit in a friendly way. Again, I considered Jordan and Jared, I would say they're friends. They're welcome on my show anytime. I hope I'd be welcome on their show, and we're in the works of a debate. But nonetheless, I think that they failed as skeptics here. And Hugh was quick to chime in and say, because I chided him and said, look, there are 3 levels of superficiality. Why aren't you skeptics using your brains to figure, well, maybe we should look at some photomicrographs and compare that to the shroud. How do we know that it's only on the topmost fibers, or the 2 to 3 fibers that we have with the Shroud of Turin? We don't. Just by him flipping it around, all he's proven is macro level superficiality at the fabric level. That's easy. Anyone can do that. So Hughes really hasn't proven anything in his demonstration, and he knows that, right? But he's just being playful. He's not malicious. He's doing a playful little thing to kind of get us to question our assumptions on the pro shroud side, right? Let's test things out. Fair enough. I think that's a fair point. So let's test. So guess what? We tested things out. And he was good enough to send me a photomicrograph of his results. So here is at 40 times the magnification. Here are his results of what he got. Here's the red markers. He's claiming, see, it's superficial. It's only on the top fibers of the shroud. I will note he doesn't specify top 2 to 3 fibrils. But if I understand, I think that's his implication. And okay, so I can't bring it in a bit, but you can see This is at 40 times. This is what he gives. Now, what's the first thing that strikes you here? Me as a layman, not a scientist. I can't tell how many, if it's only the top 2 to 3 fibrils at all from this picture. I can tell that, yeah, it doesn't, it's definitely on the superficial layers, or on the top fibrils, but where's the depth information? I can't tell as a layman. And I certainly can't tell, is it only on the primary cell wall at the fiber level? Is there fiber level superficiality? Because there are 3 levels of superficiality, right? One is the fabric level, right? The body images do not show up on the opposite side of the cloth, whereas the bloodstains are not superficial on a fabric level. That quote unquote paint or wet blood did soak through the cloth. It does show up on the opposite side of the cloth. But then there's thread level superficiality, and Hugh hints at this, and he says that his experiment proves, look, it's only in the topmost fibrils. Well, the shroud is only on, the color is only on the top 2 to 3 at most fibrils of a thread. Each thread has 200 fibrils, each fibril having the diameter of a human hair. Incredibly superficial. He claims it's implied that he was saying, well, this is like the shroud here. We're gonna find out. But then there's the fiber level superficiality, where it's even on an individual fiber, the diameter of a human hair, it's only on the outer primary cell wall or surface of those fibers. And Hugh admits, I've asked him, he admits all 3 levels of this superficiality as scientifically proven facts that are undeniable. You're a fool if you deny those facts. Okay, great. So that's Dale talking. That's just me as a layman. Who cares about me? Well, I checked with the actual world's experts, the scientists, and I checked with about 3 of them. So the first is where is it? Okay, so the first is from Barry Schwartz, someone who was actually there in 1978 and actually examined the shroud with the world's experts during the STIR project. And here's his response that he let me say. So look, frankly, the replica they used looks extremely different. This supposed 3-to-1 twill, herringbone twill that Hugh has, which I don't think he would lie directly like that. I believe that, but it does look different from the shroud. And you're going to see Barry gave me his picture of the similar photo micrograph of the Shroud of Turin. Looks nothing like what we have with Hugh Ferry's thing. But he says, look, I don't see this as a valid comparison. Also, a red marker uses a volatile liquid to create an image, and there would be some capillarity in play in their example. We saw none of that on the Shroud of Turin. So capillarity is where it's kind of absorbed in or sucked in, right? There's capillary flow when a liquid is absorbed into a textile or something like that. Guess what? That's not on the Shroud of Turin. Another image feature that's been scientifically proven beyond all reasonable doubt. So Barry's saying it would fail this aspect of the shroud. So he says, in the end, it seems that skeptics will go to any length to support their position, even by making such false comparisons. And that the photo comes from Mark Evans' collection in 1978. So let's look at that photo. Here it is. So this is the similar photo micrograph. Totally different. Nothing like Hughes. You can see the capillarity all over the place on Hughes' image here. Yeah, they're just nothing alike at all on the micrographic level, microscopic level, sorry. Okay, let's get another opinion. World expert Bob Rucker, nuclear physicist with a master's, just like Jordan's area, nuclear physics. He says, Dale, there are essential differences between Hugh Ferry's photo and the attached photo of the tip of the nose, as is common with all man-made attempts to duplicate the images. And he lists about 5 differences. He sent me the same photo as Barry did. Hugh Ferry uses a red marker to make his images. The red marker would have had pigment carried in a liquid that he used to stain the linen fibers. This process would have left red pigment on the fibers and evidence of capillarity, soaking up of a liquid in between the fibers and threads. Yep, I definitely see that. Bob's right. Boom. Hugh Ferry, Shroud Skeptics, destroyed. Nothing like the Shroud. Two, Ferry's red marker would not discolor the fibers by an oxidation dehydration process. Okay, so that's not related to superficiality, but that's another point, another minimal relevant feature that we have about what the shroud image, what makes up or composes the shroud image color. Obviously, Hugh Ferry is a shroud skeptic, may dispute that, right? So there could be a debate there with some shroud skeptics, but still, I think it's pretty solid fact that most of the scientists go for today. Ferry's process would not produce 3D information or vertical distance cloth. Absolutely true, but again, not related to Hugh's point in the video. He's not talking about that. He's talking about superficiality. So, okay, number 4, Ferry did not demonstrate that this process could produce a good resolution, negative image. Again, other features not related to superficiality, but it's important to note that. Then number 5, here is the thread level superficiality. He says, look, I conclude that Ferry produced this image by running his marker along and above the level of the threads, so that the only fibers that were touched by the marker and thus discolored were those fibers that were on the top level of the threads and extending above the level of the threads. Notice that the fibers in the threads are not clearly imaged because 1, the depth of field in this photo is inadequate, and 2, the focal plane of this micrograph was apparently above the level of the fibers in the threads. Thus, it cannot be determined how many layers of fibers in the threads were discolored. Stirp found that only the fibers in the top 2 to 3 layers of the fibers of the threads were discolored. Oops, yup, confirmed. Absolutely devastating criticism to any shroud skeptic who thinks this disproves our side. All right, finally, number 6, this is about the fiber level. Remember, only on the primary cell wall of each fiber itself, or fibril, less than the diameter of a human hair, people. Bob says there is no evidence in this photo that the discoloration of the fibers is less than 0.2 micrometers. So you were right, Jordan. Thank you. That symbol meant micro. So, okay, micrometers thick and around the outer circumference of the fibers, with the diameter of the fibers being about 15 micrometers. Thus, there is inadequate evidence in Ferry's photo of its matching the microscopic evidence on the shroud. Wow, absolutely devastating, guys. If that's not enough, I also contacted another world's expert, just for the cherry on top, Dr. Julio Fonte. And well, he said he wanted his email to be confidential, so I'm not going to share that. But he did give me permission to share something about the superficiality, and he has written a paper, which I will include in a secular peer-reviewed science journal, the Journal for Imaging Science and Technology. And this, I've linked to this paper myself before, but this will be in the blog for this show. And it's called Microscopic and Macroscopic Characteristics of the Shroud of Turin Image Superficiality. Shroud skeptics, educate yourselves. This goes over those 3 levels of body image superficiality that has been scientifically proven beyond all doubt. You're a flat earther if you deny this, that have been proven on the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so that's me being a bit of a character like you there. So anyways, the point is I'll link to this paper, read it for yourself. It will give you the details about those 3 levels of superficiality. And once you do that, I think, and compare these photos of what we have with the Shroud of Turin to the same level as to what Hugh Ferry gave us in his sloppy example, I think you will admit that you would be positively foolish to think that you can duplicate the Shroud's body image superficiality by just your little quick marker with what Hugh did there. So yeah, that's it on that thing. I just wanted to show how it's more nuanced than what Hugh presented in the show. Again, I understand Hugh's got 1 hour. He's making an entertaining presentation, and he knows this. But the way it was presented to lay skeptics and atheists, I honestly feel there's this desperation. They want some kind of quick and easy excuse to disbelieve. That's not my bias. That's what I've observed over and over again, even among skeptics who I have great respect for as critical thinkers. At least in this show with Hugh Ferry, they seemed kind of to eat anything and everything he said hey, he sounds like he knows what he's talking about the shroud. He does. I would affirm that. But let's just believe everything. Let's not apply the same scrutiny that we do to the pro shroud guys telling us about the pro shroud case to the Shroud Skeptic Hugh Ferry. And that's just wrong. That bothers me to no end. We need to be better than that, right? Let's apply the same level of critical thinking and reasonable scrutiny to both sides. You want to do it to me? That's great. Don't just believe anything I say. If you're a pro shroud, maybe I'm wrong. Put me to scrutiny. You can disagree with me. Great. Don't just believe whatever I say. Same with atheists and skeptics and listening to Hugh Ferry. Let's make sure we have an intellectual right to our opinion and look seriously to the best of our abilities at both sides first before we just buy what we're being told. Because as you can see here, that leads to foolishness and false beliefs. Okay, cool. So that's it on that front. So let me get into today's topic here. Hang on 1 second. Okay, so let's get into what this show is supposed to be about in terms of the historicity of the Shroud now. And so this is going to be my Shroud panel review summary show, part 2A. And specifically, this is where I'm going to be looking at that period of history called the missing years by some Shroud historians. That period from 1204 to the 1350s, once the Shroud starts being exhibited in Leary, France, and everyone on the face of the planet admits that's true. Including Shroud Skeptics. Okay, great. So where was the Shroud during that period? After 1204 up until the 1350s. Now, in order to, obviously I covered this myself in my Shroud solo show, part 2. I kind of covered about 3 theories. I didn't look into it in any detail. I've never really cared about this topic to look into it in detail. This is the first time I've done sort of a very quick and brief but rigorous type detail, trying to figure things out. I want to thank Jack Markworth's work and research. His work really helped me. You're going to see I leaned heavily as a shortcut method because obviously I only had 3 days. Yeah, I actually looked at the primary source data of at least a few of these hypotheses this time, and Jack was really helpful in helping me structure this presentation with based on his 2017 conference presentation. So you're going to see I kind of adopt his framework here or his assessment of some theories, but I modify it with my own slightly different approach. So that's what we're doing today. What are these historical hypotheses? Because obviously for pro-shroud experts, why is this okay? So the medieval missing years. Look, starting in the mid-1350s with Geoffrey I de Charny in Leary, France, the Shroud's historical provenance is totally uncontroversial. A flat earther would say, yep, I agree, the Shroud was there in 1350. That's how strong the evidence is historically, and no one doubts this. It's uncontroversial. Now, virtually all pro-Shroud authenticists, obviously, they don't believe the Shroud is a medieval fake, so it goes back to the time of Jesus for us, right? Well, where was the Shroud? Well, up until 1204, we think it was in Constantinople. For centuries prior to 1204, there are different theories, at least 2 different theories about, where was the Shroud prior to 1204? What's its complete history? Is it this thing called the image of Edessa or Mandylion? Yes, Russ, I heard you joking in one of the videos I watched for researching this that anyone who calls it the Mandylion is not a Shroudy because it's Mandylion. That's the way I pronounce things weird, and I'm going to call it the Mandylion whether you like it or not. Sorry, Russ. Anyways, the point is here, so some people go for this image of Edessa or Mandylion theory. Jack Markworth, on the other hand, has a different proposal, this image of God incarnate. That's not going to be a part of this show. I don't care kind of thing that much about that aspect. But either way, everyone agrees that the Shroud was in Constantinople as of 1203 or 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. That's universally agreed upon. And one of the historical texts that proves this is by a French knight named Robert de Clary. He was an ordinary soldier he wrote his chronicles as an eyewitness on the spot, taking down testimony. And in August of 1203, he gives, hang on one second, let me grab the, he makes a quote referencing something that sounds like the Shroud of, that pro Shroud guys believe is the Shroud of Turin. So he says, quote unquote, quote unquote, there was shown a long linen cloth on which was the imprinted figure of a man, and was ordered to venerate this kissing. Oh no, this is the Knights Templar. All right, hang on one second. Let me just pause the recording and find the proper clip. So Robert de Clary, he said, quote unquote, that before his fellow crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople, he had seen in the city a church, quote unquote, which was called My Lady Saint Mary of Blecharnay, where there was the sindon or shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday stood upright so that one could see the figure of our Lord on it. My goodness, a shroud with the image of our Lord Jesus Christ on it. Shroud of Turin. Ding, 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 right? Okay, so that's the quote there that all pro Shroud guys, regardless of their opinions as to where the Shroud was historically during the missing years, they agree that it was here in Constantinople, and Robert de Clary is referencing it here in 1203. But this is where the agreement ends, right? Because now pro Shroud authenticists are saying, okay, well, where was it from the period of 1204 to 1356? And there are many different hypotheses that people have come up with. How many, you might be asking, if I can get to it, what's going on? Okay, so, and sorry, just before we get into that, there are some key relevant facts that need to be explained by any of these hypotheses. Number one, the shroud was not referenced much, if at all, after 1204. No explanation is given for how Geoffrey I de Charny got the shroud, apart from the fact that it was quote unquote freely given to him. It was not sold to him. He didn't pay money to get the Shroud of Turin. Also, there's a plan that Geoffrey had in 1343. This is when he becomes a knight, and then he asks King Philip of France for financial help to build his church in the small nowheresville of Leary. So this kind of suggests that, well, what was his motivation for wanting to have this plan to build this church in the middle of nowhere in 1343? Some obviously, it suggests, well, maybe it's because he wanted to show the Shroud of Turin. He had the Shroud of Turin. He had to build a church in his territory somewhere to show it. So that's why he wanted to build this church out of nowhere. Okay, so in terms of the hypotheses, to date, there have been about 16 historical hypotheses proposed by pro-Shroud experts to explain the whereabouts of the Shroud during this quote-unquote missing years period from 1204 to 1356 or so. And Shroud historian Jack Markwart, who's been on my show, he's actually been helpful in categorizing all of these theories. And he basically says there are three main types. There are text-based theories. These are theories that account for all of the relevant historical texts. And then there's ad hoc, what I call ad hoc, or what he calls fiction-based theories. So these are theories founded upon one or more of what unproven fictional assumptions or ad hoc assumptions. And then finally, we have forgery-based theories. So these are theories based on a proven forged letter called the Theodore letter. And that it's I think I've looked at some of the reasons for it. There more, I think there's about 8 to 11 of them or something like that. Again, I've only researched for about 3 days or so, so I need to do more research, but I'm pretty confident from what I've seen that this letter is definitely a forgery, and secular historians agree with that. Things like there's no original copies. The first copy we have is 700 years later. There are obvious errors, such as the name Theodore Angelus. That's just wrong. It should be Theodore Ducas. It's got the wrong style. There's a whole host of reasons why scholars think that this is a proven forgery and that sort of thing. But yeah, those are the three main categories or types of theories, each type having multiple historical hypotheses that fit into them. So before we start getting into, and just let me show you those, any of these theories have to explain historical texts. And especially for the text-based theories, there are about 5 that are relevant here. So 4 or 5, sorry, there's 4 that are relevant here. That should say 4. So the first is that quote by Robert de Clary. This is putting the Shroud of Turin, or some burial shroud with an image on it, in 1203 Constantinople. But then there's another part of his quote that I didn't read. So let me just pull that up here. Okay, so after he talks about the Sindon, and we could see the figure of our Lord on it, he then goes on to say, look, no one, either Greek nor French, ever knew what became of this shroud, this Sindoin, when the city was taken in 1204. When that Fourth Crusade took place, they sacked the city. According to Robert de Clary, the shroud just disappeared. No idea. French don't have a clue, and the Greeks don't have a clue what happened to it. That's what Robert de Clary says. That's one of our texts. And as we'll see, this provides some sort of evidence for the disappearance aspect, right? So some theories think that the shroud disappeared from history. That's why we call it the missing years. We'll get more into that in a bit. There's also a text by Geoffrey de Villehardouin, his chronicle, again from the time. But this time it was written by a noble crusader leader. This was a leader, someone in the know, not just rank and file soldier like Robert de Clary. Now, he doesn't explicitly mention the shroud or cloth or anything, but what he tells us is kind of what was happening just before the sacking of the city. And he says that, well, look, they went over the walls, the troops went to sleep, and then the leaders went into the cities by themselves first, and they garrisoned the 2 palaces, the ones that held the passion relics, such as the shroud, that Robert de Clary mentions at the Blachernay Palace. And then this prevented ordinary men from touching the passion relics the following day when they went to town, went wild, stealing their gold, sacking and looting the city. We also have Nicholas of Taranto. He has a disputation report. This is from between 1205 and 1207 AD, but he lists off the palace relics after the sacking. And he says, look, they include the burial cloth that was there at the time he arrived at the city in 1204, or other Jack will say in 1205 AD. But I've seen others say it might have been late 1204 AD when he arrived. I don't know. Either way, once after the sack of the city, he got there and he said the burial shrouds are still there. They were not lost. This world's expert is contradicting Robert de Clary's missing notion. There's also the same thing, Nicholas Mazaretti's eulogy from the year 1207, in which it's mentioned that at the Pharaoh's chapel is housed the linen burial cloths, plural, of Jesus, and so that's specifically mentioned there in this eulogy. That's as of 1207. Finally, we have the 1247 Golden Bull during the time of the last Latin emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Baldwin II. And he issues a Golden Bull in which he ceded in perpetuity all of his rights in 22 enumerated relics to his cousin, King Louis IX of France. And we're going to be learning more about that as we get to the hypotheses. But there's a quote in here where it says, included in this is a piece or part of the shroud in which Jesus' body was wrapped. So I don't think that this text definitely is proven to be talking about the shroud. I don't, it could be just a piece cut off, and I don't think that we can use this to say, yep, the shroud was definitely still there. Maybe there was a piece cut off in 1204 and they kept the piece. This text in isolation doesn't say one way or the other. Another thing with all these texts that do mention burial shrouds or cloths, plural, obviously we do know that there, the image of is the shroud the image of Edessa, or is it the image of God incarnate? Well, there's two cloths that apparently have images on it. So from what I know of the history, it's it's gonna be an issue. Well, sure, these texts are talking about linen cloths or linen burial clothes or shrouds. Is how do we link that to being, and it's the Shroud of Turin in particular? Um, that's a little bit, well, we'll have to get to that when we assess those texts. But nonetheless, it's something that I think hypotheses have to account for, is that these linen burial cloths of Jesus are still in the city. Okay, so what are some of these theories? So there are 6 text-based theories. I'm using, in terms of historical plausibility here, anything in red is automatically at face value historically implausible. Anything in green is at face value historically plausible and therefore worthy of assessment. And again, for the sake of time here, I just copied, this is Jack Marquardt's assessment. I happen to more or less agree with him, but I admit my study into it over 3 days is nowhere near enough to have a fully informed opinion. I'm just, for the sake of time, trusting Jack's assessment on this stuff, right? So there's a couple of Tucci theories. These are historically implausible. Check out Jack's video, by the way. I'll link to that in my blog, and he goes over each theory in 1 hour. Every theory over the period of 1 hour, and he explains what they are briefly and why he thinks they're historically implausible. So let him do that. That's his work. There's the pond relic theory. There's also 2 Saint Chapelle hypotheses. One of which is by Mario Lantandresi, and this one is a good theory. We're going to be looking at this. Then there's Jack Marquardt's own theory called the simony theory. That's another historically plausible one. Okay, so then there are what Jack Marquardt calls the fiction-based theories, or the ad hoc theories. And there are 3 historical fictions on which the following hypotheses are going to be based. So there's, first of all, what Jack calls the disappearance fiction. This is, again, the notion that the shroud disappeared in the chaos of the sack in 1204. The Crusaders came in, sacked the city of Constantinople, and in the chaos, the shroud disappeared until the 1350s when it showed up. Now, one thing I want to say about this, so I understand Jack says, look, this is just a fiction. The one thing I do want to say is, I don't know. I'm not sure that's fair necessarily, because it is based on a text. Remember, Robert de Clary does mention this, that it vanished. Now, obviously, Jack does say, well, look, we do account for the Robert de Clary text. He was just an ordinary soldier, a know-nothing. He's not in a position to know whether the shroud actually disappeared or not. He's just on the streets reporting hearsay and stuff like that. But the leaders themselves are saying it's still there. So definitely any theory that doesn't account, that incorporates this disappearance narrative or aspect, doesn't account for all of the texts, but it is consistent with Robert de Clary's text. And Robert de Clary's text actually does imply it. It's just where I think that we're not warranted in concluding whether it disappeared or not on the basis of de Clary's text, because he wasn't in a position to know himself. He's just reporting what he heard and was told on the streets by others and stuff like that. So I agree with Jack there. But yeah, I don't know, just calling it a fiction because it does have some textual basis. I'm a little iffy on that. But again, for the sake of, I just went with Jack's categorization here just for the sake of time. Then there's the Smyrna fiction. This basically is a fiction that Geoffrey the First de Charny, the first guy in Louis France, the first one that is undisputed who showed the Shroud of Turin, or it was in his Louis church. He was the first undisputed owner of the Shroud of Turin in the 1350s. says, look, he went on crusade to Smyrna in order to get the shroud, or he got the shroud when he was over there. And then there's the Othon de la Roche, or Bisancon fiction. And if you remember, in my Shroud Solo Show Part 2, I actually did mention one version of this theory. But this is basically just saying, look, a shroud shows up in Bisancon, France, and the clergy needed a way to explain it as an authentic relic. So they made up a fiction or a story about this about Othon de la Roche being the Duke of Athens. He got the shroud when he sacked Constantinople in 1204. Then he becomes the Duke of Athens, so he takes it with him to Athens. And then later on, he brings it back to his hometown cathedral in Bisancon, France. So those are the three fictions that form one or more of these fictions, as Jack calls them, forms the basis for the following theories that we see here. Come on now. All right, so here we go. So number one, we have the Knights Templar theory. So this is by Shroud historian Ian Wilson. This is one of the most popular ones, if not the most popular theory among pro-Shroud guys. It just says an unknown thief stole the shroud in 1204 during Constantinople, and they sold or gave it or pawned it off, and in some way the Knights Templars got it, and they took care of it and kept it secret as a part of their rituals and initiation ceremonies. And eventually, one of the Geoffrey de Charny was related to one of these Knights Templars who owned the shroud. So we'll get to that, and that's how he got it. Then there's Jack Marquardt's old hypothesis, the Cathar theory, and you can see these two are plausible, initially plausible. That's why they're green. And this was Jack's original theory. So it's kind of similar. He just says, look, instead of the Knights Templar, it's the Cathars who secreted away the Shroud of Turin, and bada boom, bada bing, through one means or another, Geoffrey was able to get that because the Cathars are heretics. They are non-Christians. Even I would say they're damned heretics under the Christian essentials of the Bible. But they don't believe in Jesus' resurrection and stuff like that. But anyways, so they were from Spain. Eventually they got persecuted in France, and Geoffrey was one of the guys in charge of that, and he, I guess, took the shroud from them. Then there's a couple of Vastitsa theories that are not, these are based on the Smyrna fiction in one case, and the Bisancon theory. My number 12 is, okay, so yeah, Bisancon. Okay, cool. So that's that. And then finally, we have four forgery-based theories based on the Theodore letter. None of these are plausible because they're all based on a proven historical forgery, in my opinion. So these are the 16 theories in a nutshell. Now, 4 of these were historically plausible, at least at face value. So I want to look at those and run an argument for the inference to the best explanation, an abductive argument, and let's see if we can prove anything for that. So just so you know how we're going to be looking at it. So my criteria are different than Jack's, but they're related. They're pretty much the same, but just under different titles. I would look at plausibility. So what's the prior probability that this would be true given our background knowledge? Does the hypothesis in question have good explanatory scope? How many of the known facts or data points does it explain if it were true? Explanatory power is a qualitative criterion. How well does it fit the evidence or data? Does it explain it with ambiguity or vagueness? Or does it, as Jack says, fit the data? And then finally, there are the less ad hoc, right? So the least amount of non-evidenced assumptions a hypothesis employs, the better it is. And I will be employing this criterion as more or less of a tiebreaker. It's a less significant criterion, but it helps in establishing tiebreakers. All right, so let's assess the 4 initially historically plausible explanations. The first was the Knights Templar theory. And if you remembered, this was first proposed by Ian Wilson in 1978. And he argued that in 1204, an unknown person stole the shroud during the chaos of the sacking. And At some point, was transferred in one way or another to the Knights Templars, who then held it in the Holy Land up until Acre in about 1291, when the Muslims finally kicked out the Christian Crusaders, and they had to return to France. Well, when they did that, it said the Knights. This theory says the Knights Templar, they took the shroud with them back to France. That's how it got there. Now, in 1307 to 1314, essentially the Knights Templar was being persecuted by the King of France. They were declared as heretics and being burned at the stake and killed and stuff like that. And so one of the guys named killed was Geoffrey de Charnay. It's spelled, and he was the last Templar to own the shroud. And guess what? He was related to Geoffrey the First de Charnay, who undisputedly exhibited the shroud in the 1350s. And so that's how he got it. He got it from his dead daddy through an inheritance. When his dad was burned at the stake by the King of France for being a heretic as a Knights Templar. And obviously the Knights Templar, while they had it during this time, they used it as part of their initiation ceremony. And this is why they were called heretics, because they had a head idol. Well, what was the head? Well, it's the Shroud of Turin with the face of Jesus on it, folded into four, so that only the face was showing, and they worshipped this. Okay, cool. So are there any specific facts historically that we know that supports the Knights Templar thesis directly? Well, number one is this, as I said, the Templar head idol. Now, like what this was supposedly a secret initiation ritual, which was called the quote unquote supreme vision of God on earth. And this was held to be this head idol that the King of France used to help him persecute and kill these Knights Templars as the evil bad guys. We have lots of testimony, including inquisitions and I guess court proceedings and stuff like that, where people are being interrogated about this initiation ritual, what they saw, what happened. They described this supreme vision of God as terrifying or wholly awesome, and being told to kiss it and worship and venerate this thing as though it was God's presence on earth. And in fact, it was so powerful that this was said to, they didn't even have to go through the normal mass routine, because the mass, that's transubstantiation, that is literally Jesus on earth. Well, that's rubbish compared to this supreme vision of God. Who cares about mass? I mean, Roman Catholics saying that, incredible. So whatever this supreme vision of God on earth was, it was something. And obviously some debate about whether the Templars really worshipped a head, as we're going to find out. Some historians have, this is just propaganda and complete BS. The French king made up, he wanted to kill the Templars. What do? You make up propaganda. Oh, they're idol worshippers. They worship a head. There was no head. He just made it up. That's one thing you could say. Again, that doesn't work in my opinion. But even if they did have this head idol, some might say, yeah, but there's no evidence what it was. I mean, number one, there's no mention of a cloth. There's no mention of images in the sources we have. So maybe for all we know, they're looking at the head of a demon or a Muslim or something like that. There can be other things other than saying it's the face of Jesus. That said, given the way they treat the shroud in the historical context, I agree with Ian Wilson. I do believe that it's more probable than not that the Knights Templars did have a head idol, and that was the face of Jesus. That's what I think is more probable, based on the historical context that we have. As well, we actually have the Temple Cone panel, which is archaeological proof. It's basically a portrait panel in which we discovered the quote unquote celestial head of Jesus. And it resembles similar facial portraits of Jesus and the Mandalion from the Byzantine Empire back in 1204 and before, right? If you believe the shroud is the Mandalion, as this theory presupposes, there are similarities between this and what the Knights Templar were seeing. So here's a visual image of what was found, right? So this is the head idol that they worship, the face of Jesus. Supposedly this is based on the Knights Templar seeing the Shroud of Turin folded up into four, so they only see their head. And this is called the temple cone panel. So I think with these two bits of evidence, it does prove, I think they worshiped the head of Jesus. They did have this cult. Does that prove it's the shroud in of itself? I don't know. We'll find out when I get to my assessment. What's the thirdly, here's something that was very impressive. So Dr. Barbara Frail, who is a Vatican archivist and expert, discovered a writing or a letter here in 2008 in which she said she discovered a document mentioning the secret initiation ritual that we're talking about with this head idol. And it said in 1287 AD, a guy, a Knights Templar named Arnaud Sabatier, was just being initiated, right? So this is when he's being persecuted in the 1300s. They're asking, when you were initiated in 1287, what did you see? What happened? And this is his testimony. Well, he said, found a quote unquote, a long linen cloth on which was imprinted the figure of a man. Bada boom, bada bing. Shroud of Turin. Remember Robert de Clary, 1203, talking about that cloth in Constantinople with the figure of a man imprinted on it? This is the link. My goodness, absolute proof. Well, unfortunately, no. So this evidence sounds good, but it's been proven, unfortunately, to be garbage and rubbish. Even Shroud historian Ian Wilson himself has discredited this theory because it's an improper translation. Barbara Frail messed up, and her credibility was damaged because of this. But the word that she translates as linen is actually proven to mean wood instead. And Shroud skeptic Andrea Nicolati critiques her work and destroys her. And so much so that even Ian Wilson is very skeptical of her. So here's let me just show you a paper that will be up on my blog by Ian Wilson, The Shroud and the Knights Templar and Barbara Frail, where even he says, look, no, she messed up and she's not trustworthy as a scholar. So unfortunately, we can't use this as evidence for anything. All right. And we have a fourth and final evidence, which is the name similarity, right? Remember I said in the early 1300s, 14th century, Geoffrey de Charnay was burnt at the stake for his heresy as a Knights Templar. Well, who was the first undisputed owner and exhibitor of the Shroud of Turin in the 1350s? Geoffrey de Charnay. Oh, same name. They must be related, right? Well, maybe. Unfortunately, the problem here is that Geoffrey de Charnay is an incredibly common name. Charnay is just a place, and Geoffrey is an extremely common name. So the Geoffrey de Charnay bit, in and of itself, proves nothing. It doesn't prove that it's consistent with them being related family-wise, but there's no proof of this. And look, there's been 40 years since Ian Wilson proposed this for people to try and find proof, and yet nothing has come up. So yeah, I don't think this can be used to prove the Knights Templar theory directly. But again, it's consistent with it, and it is a data point that is supportive, at least, of the Knights Templar theory. Okay, cool. So let's assess the Knights Templar theory then. So in terms of plausibility, generally speaking, as we said, even Jack Marquardt admits this theory is historically plausible in terms of how the shroud is supposedly transferred, how they gained an initial obtaining of the shroud during the 1204 crusade. It's consistent with our background knowledge that we have. And the Templars they had the means, the motive, and opportunity to both obtain, hide, and then pass on the shroud. These guys were rich buggers, extremely powerful. They had their own secret initiation rituals, and they were accountable not to the king or anyone else, but only to the Pope. They were their own thing. So they had all the power. They were definitely motivated by this because they worshipped this thing or venerated it or something. And they had every opportunity. They were the ones controlling the Holy Land, and they could have hidden it. So in terms of plausibility, everything fits. Now there is one aspect here in terms of plausibility that I'm not going to judge this hypothesis on, but potentially it could be used to judge it as implausible, because it assumes that the Shroud of Turin, or this shroud that the Knights Templars are having or worshiping in the form of a head idol, is the Mandyline, or the image of Edessa, versus the image of God incarnate or something else like Jack Markor would believe, or perhaps another burial shroud. Again, unfortunately there's multiple, and I think this is an Achilles heel for a lot of theories. But yeah, by tying it to the Mandylion, well, if the Mandylion or the image of Odessa hypothesis can be shown to be implausible or falsified, this in turn would make the Knights Templar theory, which depends on this connection being true, this would also be implausible by virtue of that. Like I said, I'm not going to say one way or the other. I'm going to be assessing this question, Mandylion versus Image of God Incarnate, in my next summary show. But because I haven't done that yet, and I've never researched this question at all, really, it's going to be round one for me when I look into this. I can't use this fact to rule out this Knights Templar theory as being implausible in any way. Okay, what about explanatory scope? Remember those texts that I mentioned? How does it account for those? Well, obviously, this theory does account for the Robert de Clary's Chronicle, right? Because that mentions the fact that the disappearance narrative, and nobody had a dang clue what happened to that burial Sindoin that Robert de Clary saw in 1203. It just disappeared from history. Well, the Knights Templar hypothesis explains that, accounts for that really good. However, it does at least seem to be inconsistent with all of the other texts, or at least two and three texts, right, where it mentions the shroud in 1207, and the other chronicle talking about that the burial shrouds were still present in Constantinople and in possession of the Latin emperors, the French emperors who did the crusade after 1205, between the dates of 1205 and 1207. This theory is inconsistent with that, or at least seems to be. Again, the reason I add in seems is because, well, they talk about burial shrouds, but how many of them were in Constantinople in 1204? It does seem there are multiple shrouds or cloths or images going on that everyone has to admit. So it's hard to make that connection that it's the same cloth that's going on here, and let alone that it is the Shroud of Turin. This is a complication, but yeah, definitely these texts, they're not conducive to the Knights Templar theory, at least at face value. Explanatory power. Well, this theory does have a good explanatory power, outside of explaining some of the key texts that I just mentioned. But it does explain why the shroud went missing. It does explain the silence in terms of how Geoffrey got the shroud. Even, again, the shroud was held by the Knights Templar. These guys were heretics galore during this period in the 1300s. So obviously Geoffrey the First de Charny is not going to want to speak about where he got it and stuff. It also explains Geoffrey's 1343 plan. Why did he want to build a church in the small town of Nowheresville, Leary, France? Well, again, he would have inherited the shroud before 1343, and this would have explained his motivation to ask for financial help to build that church once he became a knight. And then also it does fit the data of how the shroud was obtained, where it was freely given to Geoffrey de Charny, according to our later sources. And in terms of less ad hoc, the only ad hoc element here that I noticed is, look, it assumes that Geoffrey de Charny, who was burnt as a Knights Templar, is related to Geoffrey the First de Charny. That's a ad hoc assumption. It's unproven, and again, they've had 40 years to prove it. Again, it seems it's equally probable they could have been related just because no one's proven it. So I don't think this falsifies the theory, but it is a relevant factor that I think would make it it wouldn't be the best hypothesis compared to another hypothesis that lacks an ad hoc component like this. So yeah, in terms of peer review and scholarly consensus, Ian Wilson doesn't really defend his views in the peer review, even though it has been critiqued by several historians, including pro-shroud scholars. So Dan Scavone, Malcolm Barber, and who's a Templar scholar, and Maria Zaccone are some people who Jack mentions as having critiqued this hypothesis. Now I will say this: Ian Wilson has written a book in 2010 where he does give some brief mention to alternatives and why he doesn't take it. So there has been some critique, I think, or response. But again, not in the peer review or anything like that. So what's my final conclusion? Well, I think we don't have sufficient positive reason to believe that this historical hypothesis is probably true on a balance of problem. We can't say, yup, the Knights Templar did in fact have the Shroud of Turin based on the evidence. But I do think it is a plausible and equally probable, at the moment, again, we've only assessed one theory so far, equally probable historical explanation for where the shroud may have been between 1204 to 1356. Is it the best explanation? We don't know. We've only assessed this. So let's get to the second theory for assessment. And this is Mario Lantendressi's Saint Chapelle theory. This is his version of the Saint Chapelle hypothesis. So let me just take a break here. Okay, and actually, just before we get into this one, so you'll notice that I'm skipping the fourth historically plausible hypothesis, Jack Marquardt's old Cathars theory. So instead of the Knights Templars, it's the heretical Cathars that stole the Shroud, and I'm kind of skipping over that. The only reason I'm doing that is just, again, top three. And even Jack Marquardt himself, in his own assessment of his own theory, does seem to make it show that the Knights Templar is slightly superior, in my opinion, based on all things considered. So that's why, just for the sake of time, I've said, okay, we've got the Knights Templar, we'll focus on that, and leave out the Cathars theory. But like I said, if you want details on that, check out the video on my blog where I link to Jack Marquardt's video, and he's got a paper on it, stuff like that. So yeah, you can get the details on that there. Anyway, so Mario Lantendressi's version of the Saint Chapelle hypothesis. Great. So this was made by Mario in 2012, approximately at that time. And he proposed his hypothesis. So he, again, presupposes, just like Ian Wilson and the Knights Templar hypothesis, that the Shroud of Turin is the Mandylion or the Mandylion. There you go, Russ. Or the image of Edessa. And he says, well, look, this was ceded to King Louis of the Ninth of France by the Latin Emperor Baldwin II. So this is a text-based theory. It doesn't incorporate the disappearance, quote unquote, fiction, or I'd rather call it the disappearance narrative. Okay, so there's an important difference there. This is a text-based theory. And it accepts all the other texts speaking about burial shrouds or linen cloths being in Constantinople even after the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204. So his hypothesis is that, look, basically the shroud was kept in the original Byzantine reliquary for about a century in the Grand Chassis of the Saint Chapelle, which is in Paris, France. And then finally it was given to Geoffrey I de Charny by King Philip VI, de Valois, whatever that means, not French, as a freely given gift for his great services to France, kind of a reward type deal. And Mario Lantendressi, who advances this hypothesis, has carefully studied the inventory records of the relics throughout the centuries, several of them, dozens perhaps, contained in the Grand Chassis of the Saint Chapelle. And he claims that the last inventory taken just before the French Revolution indicates that the Mandylion cloth was no longer in its reliquary. Instead, he just says we have this mention of a face type deal. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, so what are the Saint Chapelle hypothesis specific relevant facts? And I'm combining the positive and negative ones here. So the first is said to be the Golden Bull of 1247. Oh, remember, that's one of our key historical texts here. And in this, it mentions the giving away of a quote unquote golden towel. That's the Shroud of Turin. Oh my goodness. There you go. Okay. Now I have a little note here. In my opinion, I think it's pretty. I don't know. It's pretty out there to say, oh, golden towel, shroud, cloth, yeah, burial cloth, yeah, those are the same things. So actually, I think this is really a negative evidence. I agree with Jack's critique on this. Because look, it's not called a holy shroud or a cloth as it is in our other texts, but it's called this holy towel, which is different. What the heck is a holy towel? And even Mario will admit this, but in one of his, okay, I'll get to that in a second. But additionally, there's no mention of any images at all on this holy towel in the bull. And there should be. Remember Robert de Clary? They knew there was a cloth with images on it of Jesus. If they're talking about the same thing, one and the same thing, they're both the Shroud of Turin. Robert de Clary is talking about the Shroud in 1203 before the sack of the city. And then this golden bull is also talking about this Shroud of Turin. The French crusaders and knights knew about this imaged cloth. They'd be saying, where the heck is that? The golden towel, get this garbage out of here. I want the shroud with images on it. So this is kind of a negative evidence, actually, right? If the golden towel was the Shroud of Turin, they would have mentioned the image for sure, and they wouldn't have called it a towel. Okay, the next bit of positive evidence is that in 1525, we do have a text from the Larii clerics, who said that Geoffrey the First de Charny was given the Shroud of Turin from King Philip of France, and mentioning the Shroud of Turin, specifically historically proven fact, it's talking about the Shroud of Turin. So this is supportive of the Sainte-Chapelle hypothesis, right? Freely given gift from King Philip. He had the relics in Sainte-Chapelle. He wanted to reward good old boy Geoffrey there, so he gives the Shroud of Turin to him. And then he starts showing it in the 1350s. However, this bit of writing, again, the writing is very late. It's about 200 years after the fact, 1350s to 1525. That's quite a gap. And even secular historians say that it's pretty iffy because there are some fanciful elements in that. A story about how Geoffrey the First de Charny was released from prison during the war with the English, by literally released by like angels, just like in the Bible with the story of Peter. So it's just too late, and there's questionable historical value on this text. That said, just because there's a fanciful story in there, my goodness, Christian apologists have said this all the time. There are fanciful stories in every credible historian. Tacitus, Josephus, all these guys. Number one, we can't just assume against fanciful stories. In this case, I would say we do have probable historical evidence that this story is, in fact, legendary and fanciful. It didn't happen historically. There's not a single PhD historian in the world that would say, yeah, this is even possible to happen, because no, we know that this didn't happen in his life story based on what happened. Whereas with Peter, we know it did happen. The historical record says he was released by an angel. And the only reason you would deny that is if you have an anti-supernatural atheistic bias. So anyways, getting back to this, right? So yeah, this text, I don't think we can use it to prove the theory in any way, although it is, again, supportive. It's just too late, and there are questionable elements to it. Next, there are some similarities between some of the other relics in Sainte-Chapelle reliquary and the ones that ended up in the Leary Church. And in 1418, there was a fire in the Leary Church, or something happened in the Leary Church. Mario talks about this in his video from the 2017 conference. And there's this receipt that lists the Shroud of Turin and two other relics that were temporarily moved to another place, to a safe location during the war. So that's what it was, to prevent them from being destroyed by the English and that sort of thing. So, okay, well, why does Leary have not only the Shroud of Turin, but it's got other relics that just happen to be consistent with the Sainte-Chapelle hypothesis? And I wish I wrote down what those were. There was one that was quite unique related to Mary. I think a hair from Mary or something like that, which is Mario brings up in his video, that the fact that, well, this is a very rare relic. It's not like, oh, just the piece of the cross. Everybody from Timbuktu to Toronto claimed they had a piece of the cross, but it was very rare for Catholics to say, well, hey, I've got a hair from Mary or something like that. So there is that coincidence that happens there, and perhaps this is suggestive that at one point the Leary Church did receive at least 2 relics from the Saint Chapelle reliquary. Yeah. Finally, here's a bit of a negative evidence, right? So there are no in the inventory references, so the official records of the Saint Chapelle's grand chassis and what they have in their reliquaries and stuff. There are no references to a linen cloth. Instead, we do get a mention of a face. Mario goes into detail, and I'm going to play a clip from him about this. But it's talking about an earlier trellis, and that's the wrong word. If you want to say cloth, linen cloth, like the Shroud of Turin, you should say toile. So this is a criticism, and Mario admits this and just says, well, look, it's a mistake. And he gives an example of where they totally screwed up, where they called something because only the king had official access, or his delegates, I guess, when they're doing the inventories, had access. It's not like any Tom, Dick, or Harry can just walk in and check what's in the reliquary or the grand chassis and stuff like that whenever they want. So for centuries, we were calling something a blouse. We thought we had a blouse as a relic. And guess what? Finally, somebody took a look to see what was actually in there, and it was a little bit of cloth, apparently. So Mario says, well, look, because people weren't allowed to check these things all the time, some people screwed up. They used the wrong word for what was actually in there. So maybe even though it calls it a trellis and not a toile, there could still have been the Shroud of Turin in there or something. It's still referencing the Shroud of Turin or something. That's his argument there. So, all right, hang on. Let me see if there's a clip that I can play from Mario, the primary source himself here. So let me just. All right, so I'm just going to play a short little 5-minute clip of Mario Latendresse himself talking a little bit about his Saint Chapelle hypothesis and the relics within it. So let's take a listen to that for 5 minutes or so.
So now we're getting into the Saint Chapelle. So the Saint Chapelle, there's this Grand Chasse. Here's a picture of the Grand Chasse on the left. So in the Saint Chapelle, I probably did not mention that so far, but the Saint Chapelle was built specifically to contain the relics of Constantinople. So the whole building was built and finished in 1248, and the Grand Chasse contained the relics. And here we see the back of the Grand Chasse. We don't see the door, but there was 2 iron doors to close it and lock it. And we can see the relics inside. We're going to go through them a little bit, but what I want to say here is that, of course, in the set of relics, you have a large piece of the true cross was in the Grand Chasse. So we have here item number 2 of the relic in Liéry. So we have a possible source that Philip VI could have used to give a piece of the true cross to Geoffroy de Charny. And also there was another reliquary, not in here, but it was in the sacristy, and it contained hairs of the Virgin. And so we have the 2 relics that I mentioned before that are at the Saint Chapelle. So Philip VI had these relics, and he could give them to, and actually it's part of them. He does not give the full relic, he just gives parts of those. So here's the Grand Chasse. The list is very long. I won't go through the whole thing, but it's interesting to look at a couple of them. Like this is the Crown of Thorns. The Crown of Thorns still exists, and it's still at the Notre Dame Church. If you go in Paris, you can even see it. There's a way to see it. It's on Friday, once a month. It still exists with us. And we have here a piece of the True Cross. It was a big piece. And we still have it. We still have a piece of it. It is at Notre Dame Church in Paris. Then we have more, I would say, less known. This is number 4. Number 4 is a piece of the purple robe. It's a piece of the purple robe. And you can see the reliquary is very small. And actually, there's little windows we can see through. and it's called a tableau. It hangs in the back of the Grand Chasse. Another one here is number 12. Number 12 is a piece of the cloth used for washing the feet of the apostles. That comes from Constantinople. It's just a piece, and it's there, etc., etc. And the most important one, I will skip that one, is this one, number 18, the holy cloth inserted in a table. It's actually in a box, and the box looks like a bit the size of this thing here. Because when we look at the inventories, and here's the Shroud of Turin inside of it, but so when we look at the inventories later on, we'll see that it gives the exact size of that box. And you can see that it's kind of, I wouldn't say that, but it's kind of it's put actually underneath another relic, and it reached position 18. Because this drawing here was done in the 18th century, which according to the theory of the thesis of the Sainte-Chapelle, the cloth disappeared. So I didn't mention that before. The relics from Constantinople, 22 relics from Constantinople are transferred to Sainte-Chapelle. And on the second transfer, the Holy Cloth is actually transferred to the Sainte-Chapelle. I mean, to Paris and then to the Sainte-Chapelle. Why is it transferred? It's because Baudouin, the emperor of Constantinople, is out of money, and he's asking Saint Louis to buy all these relics, and he bought them at a very high price. And so the list of relics, I did present that before, but just repeating it here. So you have this long list of relics, and indeed you have one. It's all written in Latin here. It comes from the unofficial document. We have a copy of it. So this list is, we have a clear historical document. And number 8, Sanctam Toilam Tabula Insertam. The spelling, varies, depending on how you want to. There's some error here. There's probably an N you have to remove. Anyway.
Anyway, so I think you get a good bit from Mario himself here as to what his version of the Sainte-Chapelle hypothesis entails. All right, great. So let's get into our assessment here of the hypothesis, and in terms of historical plausibility, as even opponent Jack Marquardt says, look, this is fully historically plausible, given our background knowledge. Now, Mario himself does equate the Shroud of Turin with the Mandy or the image of Edessa. But Jack is quick to point out, well, it doesn't have to. Mario himself may have messed up there. If you think the Mandy theory or the image of Edessa hypothesis is wrong. So he can just switch and make it the image of God incarnate or some other unknown burial cloth that didn't have a name, that had an image on it, that was involved in 1204 in Constantinople, and his theory, the Sainte-Chapelle hypothesis, will still succeed. So yeah, it has full historical plausibility. There's nothing in terms of the transfers or how the cloths were obtained by Geoffrey and that sort of thing that's implausible. Explanatory scope, this is a text-based theory, so it does account for all of the relevant texts mentioning the Shroud post-1204. It doesn't depend on any fictions or forgeries, so it has good explanatory scope there. The only little note here is about Robert de Clary's thing, because he says, well, look, the thing disappeared and neither Greek nor French knew where it went. But again, there is that counter that, well, who the heck cares? Robert de Clary is just some know-nothing poor knight, self-described as a poor knight. He was not a leader. His opinion is nothing. He didn't know what he was talking about. He was just saying it from the streets. Whereas the leaders were the ones in the know, and they say the opposite. It was still there. Explanatory power. This theory does explain why the inventory list taken just before the French Revolution in 1791, I think it was, says that the Mandy cloth was no longer there in the Sainte-Chapelle reliquary. And it explains why was the shroud freely given to Geoffrey? Well, it was given to him by the King of France in the 1350s. Obviously, this in and of itself doesn't prove that the theory is true, but it also explains the unmentioned so-called missing years aspect as to why it was rarely mentioned and that sort of thing. and the freely given aspects. But it does fail to explain, okay, well, if it was given to him as a gift by the King of France and there was nothing wrong with the King of France acquiring the Shroud of Turin from Baldwin II over in Constantinople, the last Latin emperor of the, he got it from him in 1247 and that sort of thing. There's no problem. Why wouldn't you talk about how you got the shroud, Geoffrey the First de Charny? What's the big deal? Why is it a secret? Why do you refuse not to talk about how you got that? This fails to explain that. It lacks explanatory power with that bit of datum, I think. And it's also ambiguous. Does this thing even explain Geoffrey the First's 1343 plan? Why would he build a church in the middle of Nowheresville once he becomes a knight in 1343? Because under this theory, the St. Chapelle hypothesis says he gets the shroud after that date. He doesn't get the shroud from the King of France until about 1347 when he was a counselor. At least that's the most likely date for when he would have gotten it under this hypothesis. So that doesn't explain why Geoffrey wanted to build a church in Leary in 1343, or at least it's ambiguous on that front, therefore lacking explanatory power. There's some effort that it takes to kind of fit those two, that peg, so to speak. In terms of less ad hoc, unfortunately, this ad hocly assumes that the shroud is this holy towel. And this truly is the Achilles heel. It also assumes that the French didn't know anything about the Mandylion or an imaged shroud. They just overlooked the image entirely. But remember Robert de Clary, that historical text we have, the French Crusaders did know about the imaged shroud as of 1203, right before, in August of 1203, right before they sacked the city themselves. They did know about the imaged burial shroud that the Byzantines had. And it just doesn't make sense. They would just forget about it. They just forget that this shroud, supposed holy towel, which is supposedly the Shroud of Turin on this theory, has an image on it of Jesus, the full figure of Jesus. I'm not sure about that. In terms of peer review, it has been heavily critiqued by Ian Wilson, Dan Scavone, Mark Guskin, who's been on my show before, and Cesar Barta, who's been on my show before as well as the infamous Shroud skeptic Andrea Nicolotti, who all deny that the holy towel is this shroud, this connection. Complete rubbish, say the historians. Obviously, now good news is Mario Landrindresi does in fact defend his work, and he does engage with the critics, and so there are good counters, and there are people. Mario in that video I was showing, he lists at least four historians and experts who agree with him and disagree with these critics. So yeah, if I was doing, obviously I spent 3 days preparing for this, and so that entails that I didn't do a round 2 investigation. If I were to look into this and do a round 2 and then eventually 3, because my process when I do my religious research is I do 3 rounds of investigation, each with increasing levels of scrutiny and rigor. This is just my first really level of purposeful study of this topic on shroud studies, apart from just kind of reading for fun and stuff like that, very casually and stuff, and not really paying attention. This is my first sustained effort to get to the bottom of this issue. But yeah, so as a round 2, I would need to look at these peer review critiques and responses to it and look at those in more detail. Whereas now with round 1, my thing is, okay, I kind of let me listen to the primary source himself and see what I make in light of Jack's criticisms in his presentation, and I'm making my assessment on that basis. But obviously I wouldn't say I'm warranted in what I'm doing, but I'm just providing, given the reasons I'm privy to after 3 days of study, this is how I would assess this theory. I'm providing you a method and my approach based on what I know at this time, given a round 1 investigation. Cool. So on that front, so I should have done this with the Knights Templar hypothesis, but so I assign a conditional probability, so that I'm applying a Bayesian approach at the end here to get a probability. Again, it's not going to be quite the proper Bayes theorem, a full investigation kind of thing, but I'm going to incorporate elements. So we have the conditional probability. What's the probability of the evidence, the fulfillment of these 4 criteria, given the assumed truth of the Saint-Chapelle number 2 theory or hypothesis? And I said, this does pretty good. This does a decent job. It's got 1 or 2, it's got about 3 hiccups. So I mean, I should maybe lower this to 80%, but I gave it 85%. If this theory is true, it explains the data well, and I'm 85% confident of that. In terms of the prior probability based on the plausibility, it's 100% for this. It's got no problems in terms of initial plausibility on the background knowledge itself. With the Knights Templar hypothesis, I've done the same thing. So what's the Knight truth? Given the probability of the evidence, given the truth of the Knights Templar, I would say it's less, it's about 80%. There was one problem on that front. There was some problems because, again, it doesn't account for the all of the texts that we have, and this is why I gave it 80%. And there's a 90% prior probability. Well, based on plausibility, didn't you say you were going to give them a pass? This should be 100%. I'm wanting to help out the Shroud Skeptic, and I said, well, this presumes based on the Mandyline. Let's pretend there's a chance we can prove the Mandyline theory is false, thereby showing that this is implausible. So I assigned 90% for that, and we'll see how these numbers play together when we get to the end. All right, so that's it for the Saint-Chapelle hypothesis. And next we can move on to the third and final pro-Shroud historical hypothesis, and this is none other than Jack Mark Wert's 2017 theory himself, the simony theory or historical hypothesis. So what does this hypothesis say? It essentially says that, look, the Shroud stayed in Constantinople after 1204 as relics of all of the Latin emperors until Baldwin II. So this is a text-based theory, doesn't employ any fictions or forgeries, great, grand, and groovy, and it accounts for all of the known texts during the relevant texts during the period. But it says, look, Baldwin II was he became bankrupt at one point. He was desperate for money, but he couldn't get money. He was kind of a young emperor and kind of a loser, according to some people. So he went around Europe begging, and they said, get the heck out of my house. Sorry, that's SC Reviews reference, comedy channel, making fun of SJWs and stuff. But no, they basically said, get out of here. We're not giving you our money. So he's like, okay, well, what the heck can I do to raise funds? Got it. I've got relics, sacred relics. Every Christian in the entire world is going to want to buy this. And in fact, he did, quote unquote, sell 22 of his relics. Remember that golden bull of 1247, one of our key texts? He sold 22 of them to King Louis, and that's where he set up the Saint-Chapelle reliquary and stuff like that, right? But hang on. Jack Marquardt points out there's a huge problem here. The sin of simony. This is a mortal sin. You cannot buy and sell holy relics. If you buy and sell holy relics, something sacred, and using crummy, dirty, earthly money to buy a passion relic of Jesus Christ, like the Shroud of Turin, you're going to hell, my friend. The Pope is going to take your throne and tell the king to get out of here. You're no longer the king. You were dethroned because you committed the mortal sin of simony. So my goodness, what the heck are we supposed to do? Well, thankfully, Jack is like, well, this is what proves I'm right, because we know for a historically proven fact that the King Louis IX of France and Baldwin II concocted a little bit of a scheme to sell the relics without Baldwin actually literally selling the relics to King Louis. So this is called a relic scheme, and Jack humorously calls them the relic cousins or relic brothers and stuff like that. But anyways, basically, they got, for these 22 relics, they basically said, okay, I know what I'll do. Because the sin of simony, there is an exception clause, right? If the only way to save a relic from destruction, from falling into the hands of, filthy Muslims or non-Christians or heretics who would destroy it, in order to redeem that, okay, if the only way to redeem it or save it from these heathens, these barbarians, is you have to buy it, well, that's okay. Then you avoid the sin of simony. And by the way, that's not me talking. I'm talking from their perspective for humor purposes. I'm not saying that about Muslims there and stuff like that, right? But obviously, from their perspective, look, there was this clause. These guys at the time, they're heathens. They will destroy the holy relics of Jesus. We can't let them contaminate it. And so, if the only way to save the relics from falling into non-pure hands, non-Christian hands, is to use money to save it, well, then it's okay. Then you get off scot-free. You don't commit the mortal sin of simony. So they concocted this little scheme where they're like, Baldwin, I'm desperate for money. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to borrow money from the Venetians. Venetians at this time, because of the crusade, were heretics, officially excommunicated by the Pope because of what they did in stealing all the relics during the Fourth Crusade. He was horrified at that sacking of Constantinople. So the Venetians, as an entire city, were all damned heretics and officially excommunicated by the Pope at this time. So Baldwin went to them, borrowed millions and millions of bucks from them, and in order to get the money, because obviously he had no collateral of his own, he would put up as collateral these holy relics to them. Well, eventually, Baldwin would never pay back the loan. He would purposefully default on the loan, in which case the Venetians are like, well, you give me the relic then, give me your relics. And that's where Baldwin would say, oh, King Louis, I need your help. I need you to redeem I'm about to lose this relic or whatever to these heathen barbarian Venetians who are excommunicated from church. They don't have pure Christian hands. You need to pay money to redeem this. And then King Louis would pay off the loan to the Venetians. In exchange, Baldwin would give him the relic as a reward for freely given, right? So in this way, the King of France, basically, he never really bought and or sold the relics, because the king, he never paid money for the relic. He paid money to the Venetians to pay off Baldwin's loan to save the relic from being corrupted and that sort of thing. And in this way, he acquired 22 relics, and he set up the Saint Chapelle. Well, essentially, the King of France went on another crusade in Egypt, and he got captured. He lost. He was horrible, and he had to pay a ransom to free himself. But unfortunately, the Muslims captured another very important hostage. I think it was the son of Baldwin. I forget who it is now. Jack, listen to Jack's video for the details on that. But so Baldwin's like, oh my gosh, how are we going to free this hostage? And the Muslims were demanding a king's ransom for this VIP or POW. And so Baldwin says, oh, King Louis, can you pay the money to free this guy? And King Louis, he's known as a saint. He's the only king of France that I know of. He's known as King Saint Louis. He was an official canonized saint, and he really did his job to be a great Christian as best he could and live out a sinless life. So he actually cared. He's like, yep, I'm going to pay over the millions of bucks to these Muslims and free this guy, but in exchange, I want the Shroud of Turin. And in the King of France's mind, he thinks, look, I'm just redeeming this relic by saving a hostage and stuff like that. So I'm not committing the sin of simony. But unfortunately, once he got the shroud, to the medieval mind, this kind of nuance doesn't matter. All they see is, it doesn't matter about your intent. Look, you paid money directly and got the Shroud of Turin in exchange. So this is the sin of simony. And what happened is, according to Jack Markwort, is that the king's advisors kind of said, look, buddy, you're going to be in big danger. Uh, you've got to get rid of this Shroud of Turin. You cannot put this in the Saint Chapelle hypothesis, in the Saint Chapelle, or you can't claim this officially in any way. You've got to get rid of it. But how do you get rid of it? This is a passion relic. This is the shroud of our Lord and Savior. Are you just going to pitch it in a garbage bin? No, of course not. Not King St. Louis. So what he does is he gives it to his own best buddy, John de Joinville. Now, John de Joinville is a very important man, and he was a good friend of King. And guess what? He had joined him on all of his crusades, except for one. The last one that the king went on, where he got killed, for some reason, the king said, John de Joinville, you stay behind. You don't go with me this time. Well, that's an historical oddity. Why on earth? Joinville went with him everywhere. Why would he just all of a sudden not go with him on the final crusade of his life, the king's life? Well, the simony theory says it's because at that time the king gave him the Shroud of Turin for safekeeping. And the king said, keep this safe. I'm going to go on crusade. My gosh, I'm in a legal debacle here. I'm just going to give this to you. Keep it secret. Don't tell anybody about it. But you hold it for me. And he goes on crusade, and guess what? The king dies. So John de Joinville's stuck with the Shroud of Turin. And he just happened to be the owner of Liry as of 1290 AD. So this is how it's in Liry, France. So he brings it with him to Liry. And essentially, he holds on to the shroud for the rest of his life, doesn't say a word about it, because, again, during this time, the king is being officially scrutinized to be canonized as a saint. Well, Joinville's a good friend of the deceased King Louis. He doesn't want to mess that up for him, so he shuts his mouth and just keeps the shroud a secret until he dies. And he then gives his daughter, there's this thing called, what we just discovered, what historians call dower property, right? So a dowry is the father of a woman has to pay off the husband for doing him the favor of taking the daughter off his hands. Oh, I don't need to care for that thing anymore. That's not how they saw it, but that's what a dowry is, right? You're paying off the husband to basically take responsibility for the daughter, kind of thing, right? Like, okay, you're marrying my daughter. I owe you something for that kind of thing. So here's some land or something, right? But there's also this thing that's called dower property, and this is where the daddy can give something specifically to the daughter, and that belongs to her and her alone. It's up to her what she does to dispose with it or do with it as she pleases. But legally, the husband can't claim that as his own property unless she gives it to him or something like that. Well, Margaret de Charny was one of his daughters. And this hypothesis says Joinville was 85 years old when she got married, between 1290 to 1295 AD. We don't know exactly when, but during that time frame, he gave the Shroud of Turin as dower property to his daughter and made her swear an oath. Don't tell anybody how you got it. I don't want to mess things up for the king. He's a saint. Let's not tarnish his reputation by saying he committed simony, because obviously people are going to say, well, where did you get the shroud from? If they came out publicly right away, is, oh, well, I got it from my daddy, John de Joinville. Well, where did he get it from? He got it from the king. How did he get it? The sin of simony. Oops. So she shut her mouth and took the shroud and hid it away. And eventually she gave it to one of her sons, Geoffrey the First de Charny. And he started exhibiting the shroud at his Liry church, newly minted Liry church, as of the 1350s. Wow, incredible. So that's the simony hypothesis. How do we assess the simony hypothesis? Well, it's fully historically plausible in terms of how the shroud ownership is obtained, and in terms of the various transfers. These are all historically plausible given our background knowledge. Explanatory scope. This is a text-based theory, so it employs no fictions, no forgeries, and it accounts for all of the relevant texts. Sorry. However, with the why am I under the Saint Chapelle? What's going on here? Okay, so this should say the simony theory up here. I'll change that in the slides. But so it does, as with the Saint Chapelle hypothesis, it struggles with Robert de Clary slightly, right? It does contradict what de Clary says about it just being lost. No French nor Greek had a clue what happened to it after the sacking of the city in 1204. But again, this is very weak evidence indeed, because Robert de Clary, by his own self-admission, was just a poor knight, a grunt soldier, and he was just reporting on stuff from the streets. And all of the leaders, the ones in the know who actually garrisoned the palaces with the Passion relics, said later on, it's there. There's burial linens and cloths are still there. Explanatory power, this theory does explain, has great explanatory power. It explains why the shroud was unmentioned during the missing years. It explains why it was freely given. Basically, Geoffrey I de Charny inherited it from his mummy, his mom's dower property. Okay, so it adequately and perfectly explains why nobody explains. Well, how the heck did Geoffrey I get the shroud? Where did this thing come from? Well, we don't want to bugger things up for King Louis's sainthood, so we've been sworn. Joinville kept it a secret, his daughter kept it a secret, and then Geoffrey I kept it a secret, and ultimately his descendant, Geoffrey II de Charny, kept it a secret, apart from saying it was, from us learning later on, that it was freely given. It also explains Geoffrey I's 1343 plan to build the church in this nowheresville of Leary, because he would have gotten the shroud through his wife, he would have gotten the shroud from his mom through inheritance, through the dower property process, and that would have been well before 1343. It also fits the evidence of Louis's lust for relics, right? Because we know that King Louis wanted these relics and would do anything to get as many relics as we got. Historically proven fact, he got 22 of them. Why not one more, the Shroud of Turin? And he was willing to work around the simony sin in any way he could. We know for a historically proven fact that he did pay the ransom for Philip, who is, I think, the son of Baldwin or related to Baldwin. Well, what did he get in return for that? It sounds to me very, it makes perfect sense. He got the Shroud of Turin for that. And by the way, this theory fits with a bit of new knowledge, something we didn't even know about until 1996, when it was discovered by historians that Geoffrey I de Charny was John de Joinville's grandson via marriage. Incredible. This was unknown as of 1996. Even Shroud historian Ian Wilson said, wow, he was impressed with this little nugget of information. And this is definitely historically proven facts supporting the simony theory, not the Saint Chapelle theory. Ad hoc, there are no ad hoc non-evidenced assumptions that are employed in this theory to work. Peer review, there is a bit of a blow here. There hasn't really been any yet. And I obviously, Jack Marquardt presented his theory in 2017, so he's like, there is none. I did a bit of research 5 years later now, 6 years later now, to see if there was anything. And I couldn't find any like papers critiquing it and stuff. Again, I just did a brief 3-day research study on this topic specifically, but I wasn't able to find anything. So yeah, maybe my research sucks. If there is a paper, peer-reviewed paper critiquing this hypothesis specifically, let me know and I'll post that up in the blog. But yeah, so the simony theory, how does it do? Great, grand, and groovy. I gave it 95% conditional probability for the probability of the evidence that we have the fulfillment of these criteria, given the assumed truth of the simony theory. And the reason it's only it's 95 and not 100%, because again, there are no real problems at all with this theory. The only thing is there's been no peer review. So I have a 5% standard deviation when I do my Bayesian calculations. You know, I don't know everything, and there's been no peer review, so I'm not confident yet. And obviously, in terms of plausibility, it has a 100% prior probability factor. So these are the numbers we're going to plug into Bayes' theorem. Okay, so we're gonna move on now. Here's where I go beyond Jack Marquardt, right? Because look, we've looked at the pro Shroud historians and their hypotheses for where the Shroud was. But what about the Shroud Skeptics historical hypothesis for this period? Obviously, the missing years is a no-go, right? They don't believe the Shroud existed in Constantinople. They deny the starting point, and there was no Shroud of Turin in Constantinople as of 1204. But how did they explain the creation and acquiring of the Shroud of Turin by Geoffrey I de Charny? Well, we're going to look at two Shroud skeptical hypotheses on these front and compare it to the pro-Shroud historical hypotheses that we've been looking at in this medieval period. And let's assess which one is more probable, which one is the best explanation for the data. And I'll get into that in a second. Let me just pause the screen and stop sharing for 1 second. Okay, so in terms of the Shroud skeptical historical hypotheses, I've selected two. Obviously, there's going to be more than this, right? Because we can modify things and certain things, but these are the only two that are kind of available and that I've selected that are specifically referenced, just again for efficiency and sake of time. And obviously, because there can be more nuanced Shroud skeptical historical hypotheses, in order to have a proper warranted judgment, we do need to look at all of those perhaps combinations, because perhaps there are problems to one of or both of these theories that if we modified a Shroud and made up our own Shroud skeptical historical hypothesis, that would solve it, right? So basically, I'm just selecting these two for the sake of argument and giving you a methodology. I would need to think more, was there a third option or fourth or fifth or whatever? Because in order to have that, we need to not only assess all of the pro-Shroud hypotheses, but all of the Shroud skeptical hypotheses if we're going to make this abductive argument from an inference to the best explanation. But just for the sake of argument, let's pretend there are only two, and these are the only two that have been specified publicly by Shroud skeptics that I'm aware of, given my 3-day search. So the first is the medieval mad artist hypothesis. And this is basically what many fundy Shroud skeptics on the internet have this ridiculous, foolish, stupid even notion that some random medieval artist like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, all on by his little lonesome, just like Dr. Frankenstein, tinkering in his little lab, making his little artwork, and somehow miraculously figured out how to make the shrouded, these amazingly remarkable shroud images all by his lonesome. He didn't, and then sold it off to someone like Geoffrey I or somebody else, who in turn transferred it in one way or the other, and eventually ending up with Geoffrey I when he started showing the shroud in the 1350s. This medieval genius, this mad artist working all by himself, by his lonesome, didn't tell a single soul. He just made the shroud images once, these unique, remarkable, amazing, miraculous, I would even say, images, but let's take that off. This is on the history only, so let's take that part out. Nonetheless, these remarkable images that have never been reproduced in the history of mankind, not even modern scientists today, but somehow this mad artist, he was able to figure it out, but he didn't tell a living soul, and he died, and that information was lost, and we just had the Shroud of Turin. That's what these funny Shroud skeptics seem to think happened. So I call this the medieval mad artist theory. And this is just right out of the gate, it's historically implausible. It is ridiculous, because everyone with a PhD in medieval history knows that this doesn't fit the way artists work. They weren't lone wolf artists coming up with something. No, they had teams of people. They were professional craftsmen, artisans, who were hired by the king or some official body to do a specific project. So everyone would have known that the guy who hired the artist. I mean, Michelangelo wasn't just doing it himself. He had a team of peeps. You know, he was a craftsman and artistman, and people would have known his techniques, understudies, people studying under him and stuff. I mean, this is known across the art world. And yeah, so there would have been a lot of people who would have reproduced similar shroud images It's not just, oh, only one person knew how to do it and took it to his grave. That's ridiculous. No, many people would have known how to make shroud images and they would have done them. And definitely the people who hired this professional artisan or craftsman would have known about it, known that, hey, look, we deliberately made these shroud images and stuff like that. Also another aspect here is, look, if the artist deliberately made the shroud image, this mad artist, this genius, just made these remarkable images deliberately, because he was maybe hired by himself to do so, why on earth would he use an altar, what Hugh Ferry calls the big church altar cloth? Wouldn't he use, look, I'm trying to make the shroud. I'm a devious little worm. I want people to think, well, okay, no, this doesn't have to be part of that. But look, I want to make the burial shroud of Christ. And I'm making artistic images to look like this is his burial shroud. Why would you use the wrong cloth? You would use a real burial shroud, right? This is something Shroud Skeptics like to point out, is that the dimensions of the cloth and the cloth don't fit a real first century burial shroud or even a burial shroud of the 1300s. It looks like it's a cloth, a rich cloth used for another purpose. And Shroud Skeptic Hugh Ferry thinks it was an altar, used as an altar cloth at a big cathedral or abbot. Why would this medieval mad genius of an artist use that? No, he would use other cloths, less expensive cloths. I mean, don't forget, he's got to engage in trial and error as he works out how to geniusly make the images superficial and three-dimensional and negative images and make sure it's only vertically wrapped, not wrapping distortions, scientifically impossible, but again, taking the science stuff out of it. He would have to work through trial and error. He wouldn't have rich altar cloths lying around to waste as he does his trial and error. So that's another thing that just takes me out of this ridiculous Fundile Shroud Skeptic, the mad artist theory. It can be simply dismissed as such. Now, I can hear the Shroud Skeptics saying, oh, Dale, you're just biased. You're just, you don't want to believe that a medieval artist created the shroud. Okay, fair enough. Well, if you don't believe me, Shroud Skeptics, let me quote your good buddy, the ultimate Shroud Skeptic, Hugh Ferry himself, says you're an absolute fool if you believe this. Let me play his little clip for you guys here. 5-minute clip or so, to couple-minute clip. If my thing will cooperate, that is. There we go. So what does Hugh Ferry say about this? Let's take a listen.
That's one of my points that I wanted to mention. And then simply completely off the topic of myself and probably off what we're doing here. And that is that a straw horse that's often put up by people who think the shroud is authentic and they want to criticize people who think it's medieval is that they have in mind someone like Andy Warhol working by himself in an attic with an artist who sells his work to the highest bidder. And if he painted a shroud and it worked, why didn't he paint another one and all the rest of it? Whereas I think that shows a complete misunderstanding of what medieval artists were. Although we know the names of perhaps a dozen or so, of course, there were hundreds of artists who the word didn't exist. They were called artificers, artifex in Latin. They were craftsmen. They were employed by rich people, palaces, cathedrals, abbeys, to do art. And they didn't have a name, and what they did was their job. And so I don't think I don't think it's a good idea to imagine this strange little man working in an attic and then coming up with an idea which he's then selling to the local noble. I think he's a chap, and they went, right, we want a cloth that does this, and he went, oh right, okay, I'll see what I can come up with, and came up with the shroud. So I think if those ideas could be knocked on the head, and so people appreciate that there are plenty of very good Christians. I hope I'm a good Christian, certainly.
All right, so you get the point here. And it's interesting, there's a subtle little twist there, because Hugh Ferry is trying to say this against the pro-shroud guys who argue for this medieval mad genius, but he raises something that's interesting here, right? And something I disagree with him on is, they're just, so he's right, they're just doing their job. They're hired to do a project. We wouldn't expect them to repeat that project. No, I think if these team of medieval artisans and craftsmen created the shroud images, there was obviously a demand for it and stuff. I think that they would have created this shroud cloth and the images and stuff. They would have repeated it. They would have been, oh wow, I like that. I'm going to hire these guys to do the same, and there would have been a repeat, and or at the very least a passing on of these techniques. I think it's unlikely that the shroud would be a totally unique project, never repeated again. I mean, if you would have had to have invented novel techniques to create the shroud images, and given the scientific features we know of them today, and I think that these techniques would probably have been preserved on. However, I do agree with you that look, this was a job to them, right? It's not a passion play or something where we would expect them to be just cranking out Shroud of Turin images. No, it'd be okay, right? We finished this, on to the next job and stuff like that, which could have been something totally different. But I still think that they would have been. It's more likely than not, they would have been hired to do more jobs like the Shroud of Turin, or there would have been passing ons of techniques that we would have at least one or more other Shroud of Turins or like objects that image cloths created using the same techniques or similar techniques that these people employed as novel methods and stuff like that. So that's my take there. But as you can see, this medieval mad artist hypothesis is totally ridiculous, whether you are a pro Shroud guy or you're a Shroud skeptic like Hugh Ferry and you want to take apart pro Shroud people who think along these lines. Okay, so let's get back to a more credible hypothesis from the Shroud skeptics. And guess who this is? It comes from the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry himself. And I call this the Quem Queritas hypothesis or theory. And rather than have me explain it, I'm going to play another clip and have the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry himself in his debate with Jack Markworth, the Shroud historian there and lawyer. He's going to explain the theory, and then Jack kind of raises his rebuttals to it, and Hugh kind of responds. So this is kind of an 8-minute clip that I want you guys to play as to what the Quem Queritas theory is for the Shroud skeptics. Now, one thing to note here, just before I play that, is Hugh Ferry says that the Shroud images were probably made in the 1290s. Note, this is an update because originally he proposed the 1340s for when this when the Shroud of Turin and its images would have been created. He's kind of modified that. I guess he's kind of bought into some of the arguments of Jack Markworth, and now he's pushing for an earlier provenance, still consistent with the medieval hypothesis, still consistent with the carbon dating and stuff, but he now says it's the 1290s. So that's an update. But yeah, let's take a listen to good old Hugh explaining his own theory, the Quem Queritas historical hypothesis. All right, here we go.
I knew that the cloth must have had, either as a real relic or a fake relic that could attract people to churches. Where did D.T. Lack get the money to bring the shroud to Liray? I think we have to kind of set that table before we get to the documents that then purport to tell us what happened in Liray in the 1350s and thereafter.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. So, all right, cool. So at this point, we come to the part that I know Jack is really looking forward to. So this is kind of the Q&A cross-examine. So I started with Hugh in the openings. Jack, I'll start with you here. You get half an hour to kind of grill Hugh point by point or whatever you want to do.
Okay, well, this is kind of a grab bag this way, but let me start, Hugh, with what I just said. Could you explain to me the non-authenticist point of view, the history of the Turin Shroud from the time that it was created, with as much specificity as you can give, to the time that it appears in Liray for exhibition?
Yep. From our point of view, it is total supposition. But I think it's sensible supposition, and I'll explain, well, you'll understand why it's a sensible supposition, even if you disagree with it. I've got no a history like Robert de Clary, who says he saw an image of, well, no, who says that he has knowledge of an image
There, yeah, it was there.
up and down. However, this is the non-authenticist position, if you like, and that is the Quem Quaeritis ceremony, of which you will be familiar because it was enacted first of all on Easter Sunday and later on Corpus Christi as well, the Feast of Corpus Christi. After that was instituted, it was enacted in literally thousands of churches, literally all over Europe. Now, we know that because it's found in the use of Hereford, it's found in the use of Sarum, it's found in missals and books of liturgy all over Europe. And I forget his name, but a wonderful German wrote a 7-volume book tabulating 400 or 500 different versions of the Quem Quaeritis liturgy, which he picked up from medieval manuscripts all over Europe. It's in one of my books, and I can find it out later. So we know that this ceremony was enacted. It was enacted in churches, big ones and small ones, all over the place. It involved an Easter sepulchre, which was either a wooden box which you could bring out for the occasion, or right up to something that was built into the wall of the church. And of course, those medieval churches which still remain, a lot of them still have them. You can see the Easter sepulchres built into the side of the church. So the ceremony definitely existed. Now, in a fair proportion of those liturgies, the 3 clerics dressed as holy women, funnily enough, go across to the Easter sepulchre where they meet another cleric who's dressed as an angel, and the angel that they are the angel says, "Quem quaeritis?" Who are you looking for? They say, "We're looking for Jesus." The angel says he's not here, but here is his shroud, normally written as a lintamina, and the clerics then take that to the high altar and display it to the congregation, or if it's a monastery, they display it to the monks. So all over Europe, there were shrouds. That's, I think, fairly incontestable. What we don't know, of course, is what they look like or whether they had anything on them. None of these shrouds exist, except possibly the shroud of Besançon, which was destroyed in the French Revolution, and possibly the Shroud of Turin, which is what I maintain. So I think that this the shroud was made. It's an expensive piece of material. It's a huge piece of material. So it wasn't made for display in a village church. It was made for display in either an abbey or a cathedral. I've no idea which abbey and which cathedral, I'm afraid, but that's the possibility that I'm aiming for. Now, for one reason or another, it was discontinued. One reason may have been that it got terribly stained. One reason may have been that they got dirty and they washed it and the image practically disappeared. All these are speculation, which I won't go further into, but there are reasons for it. It was then given to somebody else. Now, it might have been given to Geoffrey de Charny, or it might have been given to the Dean of Leary. Either of them knew exactly what it was. It was an old shroud that had been used for the Quem Quaeritis ceremony in a large cathedral. It might have been Melun Cathedral. It might even have been a Carthusian abbey, not far away from Troy itself. The name of the abbey escapes me at the moment. Was it Melun? There's another one. Anyway, but there are various possibilities. But so the shroud came into their possession. Of course, they knew exactly what it was. Geoffrey de Charny certainly would not have exhibited it as the proper shroud, because he was a gallant and noble knight. But after he died, I think, then the dean said, "Well, we've got this thing. Let's see if we can exhibit it and announce that it's the shroud." So that would be my backstory to it.
Yeah, and you know, the way I react to that is that I think it took you probably 10 minutes to explain history that should otherwise be very, very compact. And it's just filled with ambiguity.
Okay, so that's Hugh explaining what his theory is in a nutshell. As you can see, very nebulous, very ambiguous as to as to the specifics. It's nothing like the Pro Shroud. Guys, we've got specific dates, texts, a whole bunch of stuff backing us up, right? And one thing with the mad medieval artist thing, I'm giving it a 10% prior probability. That's me being extremely generous for that hypothesis. But anyways, with the Quem Quartus theory, let's assess Hugh's hypothesis here. So in terms of the prior probability or the plausibility, I think this theory is historically plausible. Hugh does definitely great work in establishing the historicity of this Quem Quartus ceremony that they did at Easter time. And this was widely known, and it was practiced throughout in churches, big, small, throughout France. Absolutely true. So that part's historically plausible as background knowledge. A couple notes here. So as you can see, I'm giving it 100% plausibility. That's me being a bit generous to the Shroud Skeptic, but there's a couple of potential implausibilities here. So one might argue, well, look, based on the scientific evidence for how the images were made, the minimal relevant features of the shroud, we can falsify and rule out that this thing was made by a medieval artist. This would falsify instantly every Shroud Skeptic. Yeah, this was not some medieval artwork that was made, right? So that would falsify the theory. But obviously that assumes the scientific evidence for the Shroud of Turin. And as much as possible, I like to keep the scientific aspects and the history, about the nature of the images as much as possible a separate question from the historicity of the shroud. So I'm not even going to get into that stuff. Although I would say that Hugh's hypothesis, again, potentially might fulfill the criterion of illumination in terms of the Darcy Memorandum. And if you remember, we've done a whole show. In fact, that's in that debate with Jack Markworth, they get into it. And I'll just say, Hugh Ferry gets eviscerated. The Darcy Memorandum is proof of Jack all. Same with all of the other medieval documents. They prove nothing. They do not prove the shroud is a medieval artwork, nor do they even prove that it's medieval in origin, in my opinion. So yeah, that's another failure. But again, just letting you know that one might try to argue for the criterion of illumination and say it illuminates the Darcy Memorandum and stuff like that. Another unlikelihood here is something that Jack brought up, and it's the fact, why was it freely given to a small town church like Leary? After the bigger church, it was made originally for an abbey or a cathedral for this rich cloth with an image, but then for one reason or another, they wanted to disregard the shroud because it was no longer useful to them. And so they freely give it to Geoffrey I de Charny or the Dean of Leary to put up in the Leary church. One might try to argue, well, maybe it's implausible they would give it to that. No, it's more likely they would just throw it out, or it's more likely they would give it to a church, a more important, but again, less, not as big church compared to this small church out in the middle of nowhere. Again, that I'm not going to hold that against the plausibility of the theory, because again, there could be a whole bunch of circumstances that explains, well, why specifically Leary was targeted. But someone might try to make that argument that it's implausible. It would have been, even if everything Hugh said was true, it's implausible they would have given it or transferred it to Leary, the Dean of Leary, or Geoffrey I de Charny. Explanatory scope. This theory does not, utterly fails to account for the relevant texts of the Shroud of Turin, talking about it being in Constantinople post 1204, or technically speaking, these burial linens. Now, Hugh does raise a good point, one that I kind of hinted at before about, yeah, but there are multiple shrouds. Which linen cloth? Why are you, in order for this to say it lacks explanatory scope, you have to link it back and say, well, it's these texts are referencing the Shroud of Turin in Constantinople here. And of course, it doesn't do that. It doesn't mention images and stuff like that. It just it just talks about burial linen cloths. And there were, unfortunately, multiple things of those, even multiple cloths with images on it, at the very least two. And there could have been more. So it's hard to say, okay, well, this theory can't account for those relevant texts. Technically speaking, it could. You could just say, yeah, well, those are speaking about other burial shrouds. We know that there was just more than just the Shroud of Turin that was floating around, and there was more in Constantinople. So maybe these texts are talking about another burial shroud that has nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin. Okay, explanatory power. This theory does suffer on explanatory power. It can't really explain any or provide any specifics on the when, how, and why it was freely given to Geoffrey. It does explain why it was unmentioned during the missing years, namely the dang thing didn't exist until 1290. So you can't mention something that doesn't exist yet, right? So unless you're a prophet. But I would still say, well, this might struggle to explain. Okay, well, if it was made in 1290 and not 1340s as Hugh originally said, my goodness, you've got your own missing years. Why isn't the shroud talked about or referenced at all from 1290 to the 1340s or 50s when Geoffrey gets it? Where was it during this time? You've got your own little Shroud Skeptical missing years problem there, and there's no explanation of it. It does explain why the shroud was freely given aspect, because it was discarded by a bigger church and was freely given to Geoffrey or the Dean of Leary or something, or someone else. Sorry, someone else who gave it to them. However, it utterly fails to adequately explain why there would have been silence in terms of how Geoffrey got the shroud. Why would they keep that a secret? There's no reason. Yeah, I got it from the church. They didn't want it anymore. They freely gave it to me. There's no reason to hide that. So I think this is a failure for this hypothesis. It does potentially explain Geoffrey I's 1343 plan, because again, this hypothesis doesn't specify none. We don't know when he got it. Maybe the church discarded it prior to 1343 and gave it to Geoffrey prior to that. And then he said, all right, maybe they gave it to him in 1343. Who knows? And then this prompted, I'm going to build a church and I'm going to show this thing. So I think we can't hold that there. Less ad hoc. No, Hugh admits that his theory is pure speculation. It has no direct evidence to support it at all, in the same way the pro-shroud guys at least have some purported direct evidence supporting their truth. As I said, he could cite the Darcy Memo or the medieval papal bulls that he likes to use. But those have already been refuted in my Shroud review shows parts 2 and part 2B, where he's debating Jack Marquardt. I just don't think that these medieval documents can be used to prove anything. You're unwarranted in believing anything, or believing the shroud is medieval, or that the shroud is a medieval artwork. Utter garbage. Now, one thing that is ad hoc here is that, look, it just so happens that none of the other shrouds from these rituals survived to the present day. If there were shrouds with images going around as part of this Quem Queritus ritual, which was ubiquitous, it was everywhere, there should be at least 3 or 4 other shrouds that survive. Why is it only this unique Shroud of Turin? And of course, we have the Shroud of Bisancon, which is nothing compared to the Shroud of Turin. That we know that's just painted artwork, horse manure. That's nothing like the shroud. The shroud is utterly unique. Why did only one survive? That's an ad hoc assumption on Hugh's part. You have to assume that the only cloth containing this image was the Shroud of Turin. And we don't have at least a few others from these rituals. Peer review, none that I know of, none that I was able to find. Okay, so I'm going to get into what is my overall conclusion next, but let me just take a quick break. You guys won't miss a thing. All right, so my final conclusion, you can see here, I've used Bayes' theorem to make my abductive argument, my inference to the best explanation. And I've done my little calculation using the numbers. Now, I'm not using Bayes' theorem totally accurately here. I'm just as kind of a shortcut method. Obviously, I would need more information in a round two thing to do a proper Bayesian analysis. I'm not doing that here. I'm just using shortcut. And I'm comparing the best known pro-shroud thing, which I think is the simony theory at 95% probable that it fulfills the best explanation inference criteria, versus the best Shroud skeptical historical hypothesis for this period, which is Hugh Ferry's Quorum Queritas at 80% probability it fulfills the best explanation inference criteria. And then I plugged it into Bayes' formula here, and guess what? It came out as 54% probability that the simony theory is true or fulfills the best explanation inference criteria, to be more specific, over and against the Shroud skeptical Quorum Queritas theory of Hugh Ferry. So in this case, we would favor the pro-Shroud and say that's probably true. Now, obviously, it gets more complicated than what I'm doing here. Again, this is just a short video and a summary, and I'm just trying to provide a methodology, a start, based on this research that I need to delve into deeper in a round two and a round three investigation. But for you at home, you can take what I've started and you can use Bayes' theorem to do what I've done, but do use the formula actually properly, because obviously you can't just take the best of this and the best of that and compare it. You should do the sum, because look, we don't need to prove the simony theory is true for the pro-Shroud position. If the Knights Templar hypothesis theory is true, we win. If the Cathar theory is true, we win. If the Tucci theory is true, we win. Obviously, that's not more probable than not, but still, you get what I'm saying. If the what was the Saint Chapelle hypothesis of Mario Lentendresi is true, we win. Pro-Shroud side wins, right? So we need to get the sum of all of these pro-Shroud ones, because again, for us, the main hypothesis under investigation in using Bayes' theory proper is that we can prove the Shroud existed during the period 1204 to 1356 and was in Constantinople from 1204 and then went on with the historical hypotheses there, right? So any hypothesis that's conducive with that is a win for us, whereas the Shroud skeptic has to say, no, it didn't exist as of 1204, it was never in Constantinople, or not in Constantinople at that time, and it came on the scene later on, as of 1290 or later, sometime during the 1300s. Any Shroud skeptical hypothesis, we need to get the sum of those, right? As well, right? Because all of those can defeat it. So are there any theories consistent with that? We've only found two hypotheses, one of which was a total failure, and then there's Hughs. And I've artificially said, well, I'm just going to compare the simony theory, which I think is the best of the known pro-Shroud hypotheses, and then Hugh Ferry's Shroud skeptical hypothesis, which is the best of the Shroud skeptics historical hypotheses. And if we just have pretend those two things are exhaustive, then we can come out to, we should favor the simony theory. We can make an positive abductive argument that is the best explanation for the evidence and the data that we have for this period of the Shroud's history. Therefore, the pro-Shroud side wins. And again, like I said, it's more complicated because obviously, okay, great. So it's not so much that it's true, but it's that it fulfills the best explanation inference criteria. What's the significance of the best explanation criteria at discovering actual real truth? Some people think that abductive or inductive reasoning is totally invalid, and we're not rational in concluding something is actually true on the basis of it. So obviously we get into that. I'm not getting into that in this show, but I assigned an 85% probability, very conservative in my sense, that the best abductive reasoning is valid, that the best explanation inference criteria allow us to assign truth. So it would be 54% times 85%. Obviously that's going to be less than 50%, but again, it doesn't matter because I'm doing an artificial calculation here, just comparing these two hypotheses, right? But that would need to be factored in if I'm doing a true, proper Bayesian approach based on the best explanation inference criteria. And also, we need to be more exhaustive, as I said, in covering other potential Shroud skeptical hypotheses that I've just ignored because, for the sake of efficiency, I've only heard of 2 Shroud skeptical hypotheses, but surely there are more. We could modify things about Hughs to remove some of the problems, or we could modify the Shroud skeptics and say, well, let's get rid of this medieval mad artist genius notion that's totally implausible. But let's say, yeah, there was artisans and they were hired to make the shroud for the church, and they did, and something happened, so we can follow Hugh's line of reasoning or something, but instead of the church, it was made for some other purpose. I don't know. The point is, I haven't thought about these other alternatives yet. And until I've done, I haven't done a proper, full, exhaustive Bayesian analysis. You can't take shortcuts. So I would save that for round 2, or you can go ahead and do that on your own. So what's my overall conclusion? It's just an incomplete assessment. But it does look encouraging to me because I do think that with my foundation here, based on Jack and Mario and Ian Wilson's research, as well as others, look, we have the foundation, proper foundation, and the methodology to make a proper abductive argument here. And that would allow us to actually make a warranted conclusion to some degree, at least on a balance of probabilities, that the shroud probably did exist from 1204 to 1356. This is a potential argument that may work, and that's interesting and intriguing because at most, when I read these hypotheses, I've always the reason I kind of haven't looked into them as hardcore is just because, okay, cool, look, it's all about historical plausibility. That's all it is with these historical mentions. That's all I care about. Look, is there a plausible pathway where the shroud could have existed and then could have wound up in the hands of Geoffrey in 1356? Yep. Well, we've got lots of them that seem like they could work. And that was good enough for me in the past. That's why I never bothered getting into the details as I'm starting to do now with my round 1 investigation. But there's some hope here because I think there's a potential that we could go beyond just arguing for historical plausibility and say, well, this could be, it's equally probable the Shroud of Turin could be this, have gone to the Knights Templar, or it could have been the simony theory. That could have happened, and that's equally probable, just, in terms of plausibility. No, we could actually possibly go beyond that and make a positive argument that it's probably the simony theory, or is probably true, or the Knights Templar theory, or whatever, the Cathars theory is probably true, potentially through this abductive reasoning and using the criteria for the best explanation, we might be able to make a positive claim. So that's kind of my contribution here is kind of, look, incomplete assessment net. I'm not warranted in making any claims. I definitely think there are valid historically plausible theories that are better than all of the other known Shroud skeptical theories that we have. And there might be something to that in terms of making a positive assessment and claim for the existence of the Shroud of Turin from the period 1204 to 1356. Cool. So that's it. That's all I've got to say on that. Next time in my Shroud panel review summary show part 2B, this is where I'm going to be looking at the Shroud's supposed history, doing the exact same thing I did here on its historical mentions prior to 1204 all the way back to the 2nd century. I did that in my Shroud panel review part 4. I didn't do any solo shows assessing that stuff at all. So this will be totally new round 1 investigation for me based on the panel review and the papers, and had Pam Moon in part 4B come on to give the image of Edessa perspective. Jack Marquardt obviously takes the other perspective, the image of God incarnate. From my knowledge, though, there are only those 2. So we can be exhaustive on the pro-Shroud side. And same with the Shroud skeptics. Look, there's really only one theory. That the theory is there is no theory, because they didn't exist. Plus, as Jack says, you've got to explain these historical mentions. Well, what the heck are these burial shrouds that are being talked about? And this is where I think we can be exhaustive on the skeptical side. And obviously, Hugh's just going to say, well, it's not the Shroud of Turin. It's talking about other burial. We know there were multiple burial shrouds. It's not talking about the Shroud of Turin. You can't prove that link. So that's going to be the Shroud Skeptics historical hypothesis. And I'm going to be assessing those three things in light of the Bayesian approach. As well, I want to include the Larry Stolle versus Dr. Ben Witherington, my part 5 panel review on the first century New Testament or biblical mentions of the Shroud of Turin. And we went over various texts, about 4 to 5 texts that potentially speak about the Shroud of Turin. Do we have proof of its existence there? Not just the Shroud of Turin, but the shroud and its images, right? Because obviously John 20 speaks about Jesus' burial shroud, but it's just the burial shroud, kind of like the historical text that we were looking at today. Is there any reason to think it's the Shroud of Turin in particular is that burial shroud, and or reference to the images on a burial shroud, which would imply it must be the Shroud of Turin because that's the only credible shroud with miraculous images that depicts Jesus that has survived to today. So yeah, if miraculous images were formed on the shroud and mentioned in the New Testament, God wouldn't lose that to history and make a fake Shroud of Turin based on that. No, there would have to be some kind of thing going on there, we could argue. So yeah, look out for that. Next time I'll be looking at the 2nd century to 1204 historical mentions, possible historical mentions of the Shroud of Turin, and then going over the possible New Testament or biblical mentions to the Shroud of Turin. And I'll give my summary of the panel review and what I think on the evidence on that front. So with that said, thank you very much for listening. Stop sharing my screen there. And yeah, have a great week.